Canada is quietly beating the United States in one of the world's most important industries, and almost nobody is talking about it. While America spends billions trying to power its AI future, Canada already controls the resources and nuclear expertise that make it possible. Meta signed one of the largest corporate nuclear energy purchases in US history, 6.6 gigawatts, to keep its AI systems running. Buried inside that deal was a supply chain vulnerability almost nobody noticed. Both the uranium and the reactor expertise pointed back to the same country, not the United States, Canada. And it wasn't luck. It was the result of a series of deliberate decisions made at very specific moments starting 70 years ago in a government lab in Ontario. The usual story about Canada and the global economy is the familiar one. Canada exports raw materials. It is the reliable, stable, slightly boring partner the United States leans on when it needs lumber, oil, potash, or uranium. It is a resource economy with good governance. That story isn't wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that matters more now than ever. Because alongside running that resource economy, Canada made a very different kind of bet starting in the 1960s. It began building something that looked dangerous and expensive at the time, a nuclear technology ecosystem that would eventually grow sophisticated enough that no other Western country could replicate it in less than a generation. So why would Canada make that bet decades before AI existed and decades before anyone was talking about energy security? The answer starts with a single design decision made at a government lab in Chalk River, Ontario in the 1950s. At the time, that decision looked like Canada settling for second best. In hindsight, it was the most strategically important technical choice the country ever made. It was the Candu reactor, short for Canada Deuterium Uranium, a design built around heavy water and natural uranium instead of the enriched fuel that nearly every other reactor type requires. Understanding why that matters is the key to understanding everything that follows. Most reactor designs, including the small modular reactors that Meta, Microsoft, and Google are now racing to secure, require enriched uranium. Natural uranium, as it comes out of the ground, is about 99% U-238, a form that doesn't split easily enough to sustain a chain reaction on its own. The reactive part, U-235, makes up less than 1% of it. Enrichment is the industrial process of concentrating that fraction, pushing it from under 1% up to 3 or 5% until the fuel is reactive enough to power a conventional reactor. It requires specialized centrifuge facilities that are expensive, technically demanding, and controlled by very few countries. Today, enrichment capacity is dominated by Russia, China, and France. Every Western nuclear buyer that needs enriched fuel is, to some degree, dependent on a supply chain running through at least one of those three nations. Canada looked at that constraint back in the 1950s and designed around it. The Candu reactor runs on natural uranium, no enrichment required. At the time, that was partly pragmatic. Canada had uranium but no enrichment infrastructure, and building it would have been enormously expensive. Internally, the choice was even framed as a workaround. But that workaround worked. Canada built an entire domestic industry around it, trained engineers on it for 70 years, developed a refurbishment methodology no other country possesses, and kept improving it. Because the more Canadian engineers understood the design, the more they understood why that choice in the 1950s had been right all along. The payoff became undeniable when Russia invaded Ukraine. Suddenly, the West needed to decouple from Russian fuel supply chains, and every country that had built its reactors around enriched uranium hit a bottleneck. Canada didn't. Its supply chain uranium mined in Saskatchewan going straight into Candu reactors runs entirely within Canadian territory. The Candu approach represents a kind of intelligence that doesn't chase the dominant solution. It looks at what is available and asks how far that can be pushed instead. Most countries looked at natural uranium and saw a raw material that needed upgrading before it could be useful. Canadian engineers looked at the same material and built a reactor around it. 70 years later, the whole world is scrambling to secure enriched uranium, and Canada is watching from a position of complete independence. When people think about nuclear reactors, they usually assume the biggest problem is safety. But that problem was solved long ago. The real issue crippling the Western nuclear industry is delivery, and the credibility that evaporates when delivery fails. Look at the record. Vogtle in Georgia came in $17 billion over budget and years late. Flamanville in France ran a decade behind schedule. Olkiluoto in Finland took 18 years to complete a 4-year project. Nearly every major new nuclear build in the Western world over the past 2 decades produced the same outcome: ballooning costs, missed timelines, and investor confidence eroded to the point where private capital simply refuses to participate. Then Canada did something the entire industry needed to see. The Darlington refurbishment was the world's largest nuclear refurbishment, a $12.8 billion, decade-long overhaul of 4 reactor units. On February 2nd, 2026, Ontario Power Generation completed the project's construction phase, 4 months ahead of schedule and $150 million under budget, extending Darlington's operating life to at least 2055. 2 weeks later, Bruce Power finished the construction phase of its unit. 3 major component replacement, also on budget, also ahead of schedule. 2 projects, the same month, both delivered exactly the way every Western nuclear project of the last 2 decades had promised to deliver and then didn't. So what makes Ontario so different? Part of it is the Candu expertise built across 70 years of continuous operation. Part of it is a supply chain of more than 200 credentialed Canadian nuclear companies that has been doing this work long enough to apply the lessons of each project to the next OPG documented roughly 8,000 lessons. Learn across the Darlington refurbishment alone. Part of it is a regulatory environment that builds design reviews in before construction starts, rather than discovering problems after the concrete is poured. But the result is what matters. Canada has now demonstrated, in front of an industry desperate to see it, that complex nuclear projects can be delivered reliably. That demonstration is its own form of currency, and it is the foundation on which everything happening next is built. In 2025, construction began on the Darlington New Nuclear Project, the first grid-scale small modular reactor in the G7. It uses the GE Hitachi BWRX 300 design, a factory-built 300-megawatt reactor engineered to be replicated at scale. OPG expects it online by 2030. If it works, and Ontario's delivery record makes that far more credible than it would be anywhere else, it becomes the reference project, the first commercial grid-scale SMR in North America. Every project that follows licenses from that proof of concept, and OPG earns licensing revenue from each one. The Tennessee Valley Authority has already invested $400 million in the same BWRX 300 design, but it is still stuck in permit review and years behind Canada. Zoom out and look at who else is in this race, and why each rival falls short. China's building 38.5 gigawatts of new nuclear capacity and using its own SMR design as a Belt and Road diplomatic instrument. But any nation that accepts a Chinese reactor deal accepts decades of political dependency alongside it. Russia once controlled roughly 70% of global uranium enrichment capacity and held reactor contracts across 20 countries until Ukraine. When every nation built around Russian fuel discovered that energy access was a political weapon, the United States is serious about nuclear. But its most recent build, Vogtle, came in $17 billion over budget and years late. And TVA's SMR won't be online until 2033 at the earliest. The US is at the very beginning of rebuilding a nuclear industry it largely let atrophy.